The Korean mafia boss had just done something no billionaire, no president, and no football federation had ever imagined possible. He bought every single ticket to the World Cup final, leaving an entire football stadium completely empty for just one person, not for a celebrity, not for a queen, but for his dying black wife, whose greatest wish was to watch one last football match in peace before cancer stole the little time she had left. As the players prepared to walk onto the pitch and an entire football stadium sat eerily empty, the world had only one question. How could a woman inspire Korea's most feared Korean mafia boss to do something this impossible? The answer began years earlier, with a single gunshot. Stay with me, because this isn't just the story of a Korean mafia boss and the World Cup final. It's the unforgettable love story that made an entire football stadium fall silent for one dying woman. Amara worked in the legal compliance department of one of Seoul's largest manufacturing conglomerates, a job her parents were proud of, a job that paid well and asked little of her beyond long hours and careful paperwork. She had grown up in Seoul, the only child of Ghanaian parents who settled in the city 2 decades earlier, and though people still stared sometimes, she had learned long ago how to walk through a room like she belonged in it. Outside of work, her real joy came every evening at exactly 9, when she settled onto her small couch with a bowl of rice and watched whichever match was playing that night. She loved football the way some people loved religion, and she could argue for an hour about whether Ronaldo or Messi deserved to be called the greatest, switching sides depending on her mood and refusing to ever settle the debate for good. That evening she had stayed late at the office reviewing a shipment record that did not add up, numbers that pointed toward waste disposal contracts nobody wanted to explain to her. Her supervisor told her to drop it. She photocopied the documents instead and told herself she would look closer once she got home. The parking garage beneath her office building was nearly empty when she stepped out that night, heels echoing against concrete, arms full of files she had promised to review before morning. She did not hear the footsteps behind the pillar until it was too late to turn back, and by then a man was already stumbling toward her, blood soaking through his shirt, 3 others chasing behind him with weapons drawn. He grabbed her wrist before she could scream, pulled her behind the pillar with a strength that startled her, and pressed a finger to his lips. His eyes were sharp even through pain, and something about the calm in his voice, low and controlled despite the wound in his side, made her stay still instead of fighting him off. "Stay quiet," he said, "and you live." The men chasing him ran past without noticing, boots slapping against wet concrete, voices fading into the distance. Amara's whole body trembled once they were gone, papers still clutched to her chest, and she looked up at the stranger properly for the first time, at his torn suit, his blood-soaked hand, the way his jaw tightened against pain he refused to show. "Who are you?" she asked, though some part of her already understood the answer would change everything. He did not answer. Instead, he studied her face, her eyes, the trembling hands, still holding onto paperwork like it could shield her from what had just happened, and something shifted behind his expression, something like curiosity he clearly did not welcome. "Forget tonight," he said finally, voice rough. "Forget my face." Then he was gone, disappearing into the shadows of the garage before she could ask another question, leaving her standing alone, with her heart pounding and blood on the concrete where he had been. The next day, Amara told no one what happened. She convinced herself it was a nightmare, a trick of exhaustion after a long week, though the image of his eyes refused to leave her. A black car parked outside her office building that afternoon, sleek and silent among the rusted taxis and delivery trucks, and though she told herself it meant nothing, she noticed it twice through the window before she left for the day. That evening, as she walked home, the same black car pulled up beside her, window rolling down slowly. The stranger from the garage looked back at her, cleaner now, wound bandaged beneath a fresh shirt, expression unreadable in a way that made her stomach tighten with something between fear and curiosity. "Get in," he said. "I don't know you." "You don't need to," he replied. "You need to listen." Against every instinct telling her to run, Amara stepped closer to the car instead. some reckless part of her curious, despite the danger radiating off him like heat. She got in. "The men chasing me last night work for the company you found those shipment records for," he said once the car pulled away. "They already know your name." Fear crawled up her spine, cold and sudden. "How would you know that?" "Because I made it my business to know," he said, "the moment you became a target." He gave his name before dropping her home that night, quiet and clipped, like a warning wrapped inside two words: Choi Tae Jun. She did not sleep well after that, turning the name over in her mind, alongside the memory of his hand, steady around her wrist, even while bleeding. 2 days later, walking home from work, she noticed 2 men trailing behind her, matching her pace whenever she slowed. Panic rose in her throat as she quickened her steps, and moments later, the black car appeared at the end of the street, the 2 men scattering the instant they saw it approach. Tae Jun stepped out, jaw tight with an anger she suspected was not directed at her. "Next time, call the number I gave you before they get close enough to touch you." "Why do you even care what happens to me?" she asked. He studied her for a long moment, streetlight casting shadows across features that were, she noticed now, striking in a way that had nothing to do with danger. "Because you found something they wanted buried," he said, "and now I am the only thing standing between you and them." The following weeks unfolded quickly. Tae Jun appeared without warning, sometimes outside her office, sometimes near her apartment, always with some excuse about her safety that barely concealed the real reason he kept returning. She resisted him at first, telling herself she wanted nothing to do with a man whose world clearly involved blood and secrecy. Yet each time he left, she found herself waiting for the next time he would appear. One evening he showed up at her door, right at 9, just as she was settling in front of the television with her bowl of rice. She opened the door, startled, and he glanced past her shoulder at the match already playing on the screen. "You are a football fan," he said, sounding almost amused. "I am a serious football fan," she corrected, pulling him inside without quite deciding to. "Sit down. Messi is about to do something ridiculous." He sat, stiffly at first, clearly unused to being told what to do inside someone else's home, and watched the match beside her in near silence. When Messi curled a free kick into the top corner minutes later, Amara leapt off the couch shouting, and Tae Jun watched her celebrate with an expression she had never seen on him before, something soft and unguarded. "You really love this game," he said. "More than most people," she admitted, dropping back onto the couch beside him. "Ronaldo would have scored that from further out, by the way." "I don't know either of their names," he said, and she gasped so dramatically that he almost laughed, a sound she suspected did not come easily to him. From that night forward, he began arriving most evenings just before 9, never announcing it, simply appearing at her door with quiet food from wherever he had been that day. She taught him the rules of the game slowly, arguing every call, and he listened in a way that surprised her, quiet and attentive, offering nothing but presence, and it undid something in her chest she had spent years keeping locked. He never told her much about his own life directly, guarded fragments about a world built on inherited power he never asked for, a world where trust was a currency more dangerous than money. She did not push. Instead, she noticed the way he relaxed slightly more each evening he sat beside her, the way his shoulders lowered from whatever weight they carried outside her door, and she understood, without needing him to say it, that these small, ordinary evenings had become something he needed as much as she did. One night, midway through a match neither of them was truly watching anymore, he reached over and laced his fingers through hers on the couch, a small gesture that felt larger than anything he had done before. She looked at him, heart suddenly loud in her ears. "You should walk away from me," he said quietly, though his hand did not let go. "While you still can." "Why are you telling me this now?" "Because every day you stay closer to me, the danger around you grows," he said. "I have enemies who would use you against me without hesitation." She turned fully toward him, chin lifted despite the fear curling in her stomach. "Then let them try," she said. "I am done being careful." Something in his expression cracked at her words, the careful control he wore like armor, slipping just enough for her to see the depth of what he felt for her, raw and overwhelming and clearly terrifying to a man who had spent his whole life avoiding vulnerability. He lifted her hand gently, pressing his lips against her knuckles instead of her mouth, a restrained gesture that somehow felt more intimate than anything else could have. "You have no idea what you are choosing," he murmured. "Then teach me," she whispered back. His phone buzzed violently in his pocket before either of them could move closer, shattering the moment entirely. He answered with visible reluctance, expression darkening within seconds as he listened to whoever spoke on the other end. "I have to go," he said, voice suddenly distant. "What happened?" "Someone found out about you," he said, already moving toward the door. "I need to make sure they regret it." He left her standing alone in her apartment, the match still playing unwatched on the television, heart pounding with a mixture of longing and fear that felt entirely too large for the short time she had known him. 3 days passed without a single word from him, and Amara spent each one convinced something terrible had happened. She avoided sleep, checked her phone constantly, and left the television off entirely, unable to enjoy the game without him arguing beside her. On the 4th night, exhausted and desperate, she finally heard a knock she recognized without needing confirmation. She opened the door to find him standing there, bruised along one cheek, exhaustion carved deep into his features, but alive. Relief crashed through her so violently that she pulled him inside without thinking, hands checking his face, his shoulders, searching for wounds she could not see. "You disappeared for 3 days, she said, anger mixing with the relief flooding her chest. "Do you understand what that did to me?" He caught her hands, stilling them against his chest, eyes searching hers with an intensity that stole the breath from her lungs. "I handled the men who found out about you," he said quietly. "They will not be a problem again." "I was scared," she admitted quietly, "not of you, for you." Something shifted completely in his expression then, the last of his guarded control giving way entirely. He drew her closer, forehead resting gently against hers, breath unsteady in a way she had never seen from him before. "Nobody has ever waited for me like that," he said. "Then get used to it," she whispered. Their lips met softly this time, no interruption, no danger pulling them apart, just the quiet culmination of weeks spent circling each other with careful restraint, finally giving way. The kiss was gentle, careful, filled with everything neither of them had said aloud yet, and when they finally pulled back, both were breathless in a way that had nothing to do with fear. From that night forward, their evenings became a ritual neither of them spoke about, but both protected fiercely. 9 every night, her couch, a match on the screen, his arm eventually finding its way around her shoulders as the season went on. She discovered he learned faster than he let on, soon shouting at referees with the same passion she did, though he still refused to admit Messi deserved more credit than Ronaldo, an argument that became their favorite kind of fight. Her work continued gaining dangerous attention as she kept digging into the shipment records, and Tae Jun never asked her to stop, though she knew it worried him, and that restraint, that refusal to control her, made her trust him more deeply than she expected. When the company finally faced an internal investigation because of what she uncovered, he sat quietly outside the building the whole day, waiting to make sure she left safely, saying nothing about the danger he had clearly worked to keep away from her, without her ever knowing the full extent of it. That night, under a sky thick with stars rarely visible over the city, Tae Jun took her hand and admitted quietly that he wanted a life with her, one built on more than stolen evenings and careful secrecy. She listened, heart racing, understanding exactly what he was asking without him needing to say the word itself, and when she whispered her answer, it was steady and certain, despite every danger still surrounding them both. They married quietly months later, in a small ceremony witnessed by only 2 people they trusted completely, their union hidden from a world that would use her existence against him without hesitation. Amara kept her name unchanged in public records, her job continuing exactly as before, while behind closed doors she became something entirely different, the quiet center of a dangerous man's carefully guarded heart. Married life kept its shape around the same small rituals that built it. 9 every evening, without exception, wherever he was in the world, Tae Jun found a way to be home in time for kickoff. He learned to cook her favorite dish badly and proudly, learned the names of players she idolized, learned to sit through her shouting at the screen without ever once telling her to be quiet. On nights when Messi scored, she made him admit it was beautiful. On nights when Ronaldo scored, he made her admit the same, and she always did, laughing, never quite willing to give either man the final word. 2 years passed this way, seasons folding into each other, their bond deepening in the privacy only they shared. Then, on an ordinary morning that began like countless others before it, Amara woke feeling a tiredness that sleep could not explain, a heaviness settling into her bones that she dismissed at first as nothing more than exhaustion from another long week at work. She did not know yet that this small, quiet tiredness would become the first thread in an unraveling neither of them could stop, the beginning of a battle that no amount of money, power, or love could fully win. The fatigue worsened over following weeks, accompanied by bruises that appeared without explanation and a persistent cough she blamed on the changing season. She started missing their 9 o'clock matches, falling asleep on the couch before kickoff, and Tae Jun noticed before she admitted anything was wrong, watching her movements slow, watching color fade slowly from her face, despite her insistence that she was simply tired from work. "You need to see a doctor," he said one evening, voice edged with worry he tried to hide. "I am fine," she insisted, though even she no longer believed it fully. He did not argue further that night, but the following morning she found an appointment already scheduled at one of the city's most respected hospitals, arranged quietly, through connections she suspected cost more money than she wanted to know about. She went, mostly to ease his worry, expecting reassurance and a quick return to her normal routine. Instead, after hours of tests and scans, a doctor sat across from them both with an expression that made Amara's stomach drop before a single word left his mouth. Tae Jun's hand found hers instinctively, gripping tight enough to ground them both against whatever was coming. "The results show something serious," the doctor began carefully. "We need to discuss this thoroughly." "Tell us," Tae Jun said, voice steady, despite the fear evident beneath it. The doctor exhaled slowly before continuing. "The tests indicate an advanced stage of cancer, already present in multiple areas. We need to run further tests to confirm the full extent, but the current markers suggest this has been developing for some time." The word landed like a blow neither of them could brace against. Amara's ears rang, the doctor's continued explanation blurring into distant noise as she stared blankly at the wall, unable to process the sentence that had just reshaped her entire future in seconds. Tae Jun said nothing for a long moment, his hand trembling slightly against hers, the first crack of fear she had ever witnessed in a man who had faced down armed enemies without flinching. When he finally spoke, his voice broke in a way that terrified her more than the diagnosis itself. "There has to be something we can do," he said. "Anything. Money is not a problem." The doctor's expression carried the quiet weight of experience, delivering the same impossible answer too many times before. "We will do everything medically possible," he said gently. "But I need you both to understand the seriousness of what we are facing." Amara turned to look at her husband then, seeing for the first time the terror hidden beneath his composed exterior, and something inside her steadied, despite the devastation of the moment. She squeezed his hand back, forcing her voice to remain calm, even as everything inside her trembled. "We will face this together," she said. "Whatever comes." He nodded once, unable to speak past the emotion closing his throat, and in that quiet hospital room, surrounded by machines and sterile silence, the two of them held on to each other as the ground beneath their carefully built life began, slowly and irreversibly, to shift. Further tests confirmed what the first doctor feared, revealing a cancer that had already spread beyond what surgery alone could remove. Specialists were consulted from across the country, then from beyond it, Tae Jun sparing no expense in his desperate search for options, chasing every possibility with the same relentless determination he brought to every other battle in his life. Amara watched him during those weeks with a heavy heart. seeing the toll the search took on him even as he tried to hide it from her. He barely slept, spending nights on calls with doctors overseas, mornings reviewing research papers he barely understood but refused to stop reading anyway, desperate for any thread of hope he could offer her. One evening, exhausted from another round of consultations that yielded no new answers, he sat beside her hospital bed with his head bowed, silence stretching heavy between them, the television in the corner playing a match neither of them had the strength to watch properly. She reached over and took his hand gently, waiting until he looked up at her before speaking. "You cannot fight this the way you fight everything else," she said softly. "Not with anger, not with money." "Then how?" he asked, voice raw with a helplessness she had never heard from him before. "How am I supposed to fight something I cannot even see?" She held his gaze steadily, despite the exhaustion pulling at her own body. "By staying beside me at 9 every night," she said, attempting a small smile. "That is the only fight that matters now." He pressed his forehead gently against her hand, shoulders shaking with emotion he could no longer contain, and for the first time since the diagnosis, Amara found herself comforting him instead of the other way around, understanding with painful clarity that love, in its truest form, sometimes meant carrying someone else's fear alongside your own. Treatment began soon after, aggressive rounds designed to slow what could not be stopped entirely. The chemotherapy drained her strength steadily, each session leaving her weaker than before, though she insisted on watching her matches from bed whenever her energy allowed, unwilling to let illness take away the one joy that had always been entirely her own. Weeks into treatment, Amara noticed the first strands of hair loosening in her hands during a routine shower, evidence of what she already knew was coming, but had somehow hoped to avoid. She stood frozen under the water, watching pieces of herself disappear slowly down the drain, grief settling over her, in a way the diagnosis itself had not fully accomplished until this moment. By the following week, what remained came away easily, leaving her scalp bare and unfamiliar beneath her fingers. She avoided mirrors those first few days, unable to reconcile the reflection with the woman she had always known herself to be, ashamed in a way she could not fully explain even to herself. Tae Jun never mentioned the change directly, though she caught him watching her sometimes with an expression she could not quite name, somewhere between heartbreak and fierce protectiveness. She began wearing wigs immediately, carefully chosen to match her natural hair, determined that even within their own home, he would not see this particular loss laid bare. She told herself it was practical, simple comfort in familiarity, but beneath that excuse lived a quieter truth she refused to voice aloud, a fear that he would look at her bare scalp and see illness where he once saw beauty, a fear that love built on attraction might not survive what disease had taken from her. One evening, weeks into this careful concealment, Amara stood before the bathroom mirror after a long, difficult day of treatment, removing her wig slowly with trembling hands, tears already gathering before she even looked up at her reflection. She had not heard him enter, too consumed by her own grief to notice the door opening quietly behind her. Tae Jun stepped into the doorway and stopped, watching her shoulders shake with silent tears, watching her stare at her own bare scalp like it belonged to a stranger she no longer recognized. For a long moment, neither of them spoke, the weight of everything unsaid filling the small space between them entirely. Then he moved toward her slowly, footsteps deliberate, and reached the wig where it sat abandoned on the counter beside her trembling hands. Gently, without a single word, he lifted it away completely, setting it aside where she could not immediately reach for it again. She gasped softly, instinctively reaching to cover her head with both hands, humiliation crashing over her in a wave she could not control. "Please," she whispered, voice breaking, "don't look at me like this." He did not answer with words. Instead, he knelt slowly in front of her, taking her trembling hands gently away from her scalp, holding them still against his chest, while he looked at her fully, without flinching, without hesitation, without the pity she feared most. Then, slowly, he leaned forward and pressed his lips softly against the bare skin of her scalp, a kiss filled with a tenderness that undid every fear she had carried alone in silence for weeks. She froze for a moment, breath catching, before the tears came harder, no longer from grief alone, but from something overwhelming and healing all at once. "You are still the most beautiful thing I have ever seen," he whispered against her skin, voice thick with emotion. "Nothing about you could ever change that." She broke down completely then, sobs shaking her entire body as he wrapped his arms around her fully, holding her steady while she released weeks of quiet shame she had never spoken aloud. He held her like that for a long time, saying nothing further, simply present, simply hers, proving through action what words alone could never fully capture. When her tears finally slowed, she looked up at him, eyes red and swollen, but steadier than before. "I was so afraid you would stop seeing me the way you used to," she admitted quietly. He cupped her face gently, thumb brushing away the last of her tears. "Illness cannot take away what I feel for you," he said. "Only you could ever do that. And even then, I doubt I would let you." A small, watery laugh escaped her despite everything, and for the first time since the diagnosis, Amara felt something close to peace settle over the fear that had consumed her for weeks. She rested her head against his chest, listening to his steady heartbeat, allowing herself, just for that moment, to forget the illness spreading quietly through her body. Later that night, too tired to move from the couch but unwilling to give up her ritual entirely, she leaned against him while a replay of an old match played quietly on the television, some final from years earlier neither of them had watched the first time. Halfway through, without looking away from the screen, she murmured that if she ever got the chance to see one more final in person before the end, she would want it to feel exactly like this, quiet, just the two of them, no crowd loud enough to drown him out. Tae Jun said nothing in response, but something settled behind his eyes, quiet and resolute, a thought he did not share with her that night, though it would return to him later with a weight neither of them could yet imagine. Outside their window, the city moved on unaware, lights flickering against the night sky, ordinary life continuing exactly as it always had, indifferent to the quiet war being fought inside their home. Neither of them knew yet how much time remained, how many more nights they would share like this one, how soon the illness would demand something even the deepest love could not fully answer. Months passed, and the treatments that once promised time now only brought smaller pieces of it. Amara grew thinner, her laughter softer, her energy rationed carefully across each day, like something precious running low. Yet every evening at 9, no matter how tired her body had become, she still found the strength to sit beside her husband and watch a match, refusing to let illness take the one ritual that had first taught her to trust him. Some nights she barely made it through the first half before sleep pulled her under, her head resting against his shoulder while the commentary continued quietly in the background. Tae Jun never woke her to finish watching. He simply muted the volume, wrapped a blanket tighter around her, and stayed there long after the final whistle blew, unwilling to move even an inch if it meant disturbing the rare peace on her face. One night, during a highlight reel replaying old finals, she turned to him with a tiredness in her eyes that had nothing to do with sleep. "I keep thinking about the World Cup," she said quietly. "I used to promise myself I would go one day, sit in a real stadium, feel the noise in my chest." "You still can," he said, though both of them understood how complicated that sentence had become. "There is one happening soon," she said, a small, wistful smile crossing her face. "I looked it up last week. I did not tell you, because I did not want you to worry about arranging something impossible." He said nothing that night, but something behind his eyes sharpened into quiet resolve. The same look she remembered from the night she first told him she wanted to see one final before the end. He kissed her forehead and told her to rest, and long after she had fallen asleep against his shoulder, he sat awake, already working through a plan he had no intention of sharing until it was finished. The following week, Tae Jun disappeared for long stretches during the day, returning each evening at 9 without fail, offering no explanation beyond tired smiles and vague mentions of business. Amara noticed the secrecy, but chose not to press him, too exhausted most days to chase answers, trusting that whatever he was building, he would reveal it when he was ready. What she did not know was that Tae Jun had begun quietly buying tickets to the upcoming World Cup final, not a section, not a block of seats, but every single ticket sold for that match, moving through brokers, sponsors, and federation contacts with a determination that frightened even the men who worked for him. He needed the stadium empty of strangers, empty of cameras that could expose a wife the world had never been allowed to know existed, empty of crowds that could exhaust a body already fighting for every breath. It was not simple. Federation officials refused him twice, citing rules against a single buyer acquiring an entire venue, insisting the optics alone made it impossible regardless of price. Tae Jun did not raise his voice or make a single threat. He simply returned a third time with an offer large enough to fund an entire youth football program in the host country for the next decade, and by the end of that meeting, the impossible had quietly become policy. It took weeks and an amount of money most people could not imagine spending on a single evening, but by the time the final approached, Tae Jun had done what should have been impossible. Every seat in the stadium belonged to him. He told no one why. He simply arranged medical staff, quiet security, and a private box positioned close enough to the field that she would feel like she was standing on the grass herself. His closest associate, a man who had followed him through every dangerous decision for over a decade, finally asked him directly why he needed an entire stadium emptied for one evening, unable to understand the purpose behind such an extravagant, illogical request. Tae Jun answered without hesitation, voice quiet in a way his associate had rarely heard from him. She has spent her whole life being seen by strangers who never truly looked at her, he said. For one night, I want her to look at something that belongs completely to her, without anyone else's eyes in the way. His associate said nothing further after that, simply nodding once, before returning to the arrangements, understanding finally that this was not a display of wealth, but a final act of devotion neither money nor power could fully measure. Word spread quietly among the small circle of people managing the logistics that the buyer's identity and reason were to remain confidential, and remarkably, given the size of the transaction, the secret held until the story became public only after Tae Jun's arrest, months later. He revealed the plan only 2 nights before the match, sitting beside her hospital bed where she had been admitted for a difficult round of treatment, holding a folded ticket in his palm like it was something fragile. "I bought the stadium," he said simply. She blinked at him, too tired to fully understand. "What do you mean?" "Every ticket," he said, "for the final. It will be empty except for us." Tears filled her eyes before she could stop them. Disbelief and joy tangled together in a way that made her laugh weakly, despite her exhaustion. "You cannot buy an entire stadium, Tae Jun." "I already did," he said, voice quiet but certain. "You are going to see your final." She reached for his hand, gripping it with whatever strength remained in her fingers, overwhelmed by a gesture so large it barely felt real. "This is insane," she whispered. "It is the only thing I know how to do," he said. "I could not save you from what is happening inside your body. I could at least give you this." Her doctor resisted the idea at first, warning that travel and excitement of any kind carried real risk, given how fragile her condition had become. Tae Jun listened to every concern without argument, then arranged for the doctor herself to attend the match alongside a small medical team, ensuring nothing was left to chance. Only once every safeguard was in place did the doctor finally agree, watching Amara's face light up at the news with an expression that told her clearly this was not a request anyone could refuse. The night of the final arrived with a strange, aching beauty neither of them had expected. Amara was carefully moved from the hospital into a private car, wrapped in blankets despite the mild evening air, her body weak, but her eyes bright with an excitement that had not shown itself in weeks. Tae Jun sat beside her the entire ride, holding her hand, watching her stare out the window like a child seeing the city for the first time. The stadium, when they arrived, stood massive and silent under bright lights, completely empty except for a small medical team stationed discreetly near the entrance and 2 guards positioned far enough away to offer privacy. Amara stepped out slowly, leaning against her husband's arm, and gasped softly at the sight of endless empty seats stretching upward into the night sky, all of them hers for one final evening. "This is real," she whispered, voice trembling with disbelief. "Every seat," he said, guiding her gently toward the private box overlooking the pitch. "Nobody but us." She settled into a chair near the front of the box, wrapped in blankets, her husband beside her, and watched as the players ran onto the field below for the biggest match of their careers, unaware that the only two people watching from the stands carried a story larger than the game itself. The match began, and for a while, everything else disappeared. Amara gasped at every near miss, gripped Tae Jun's hand tightly during a dangerous counterattack, and laughed freely when a player she liked scored the opening goal midway through the first half. For those minutes, illness faded into the background, replaced entirely by the simple joy she had chased her whole life, finally granted in its fullest, most impossible form. "This is everything I ever wanted," she said, resting her head against his shoulder as the crowd noise from the broadcast speakers echoed faintly around the empty stadium, a strange, haunting reminder that the real energy of the moment came only from the two of them. "I would have bought 100 stadiums if it meant seeing you smile like this," he murmured. She turned to look at him then, eyes soft, despite the exhaustion behind them. "Renew our vows with me," she said suddenly. "Right here, tonight." He froze for a moment, caught off guard, before nodding slowly, throat tightening with emotion. He refused to let overwhelm him yet. "Right here," he agreed. "In front of nobody but this field, and everything it means to you." They stood together near the front of the box, the match continuing below them, unaware and indifferent, while Tae Jun took both her trembling hands in his and spoke quietly, promising again everything he had promised the day they married in secret. Love without condition, loyalty without end, devotion that illness itself could not diminish. "I promise to stay beside you," he said, "in every version of the life we were given, the one hidden in shadows and the one we are living tonight, under all this light." Amara repeated her own vows back to him, voice weak but steady, tears slipping freely down her face as she spoke words that felt more like farewell than celebration, though neither of them said that word aloud. "I promise that wherever I go next," she said, "some part of me stays here, in this stadium, in this moment, with you." Midway through the second half, as the crowd noise from the broadcast swelled with the tension of a match heading toward its climax, Amara's breathing grew suddenly shallow. She gripped his arm, her body trembling, and Tae Jun's entire focus shifted instantly away from the game, panic flooding through him as he called for the medical team waiting nearby. "Stay with me," he said, voice breaking as he lowered her gently into her seat, cradling her face in his hands. "Amara, stay with me." She looked up at him, exhaustion and peace mingling strangely in her expression, and managed a small, trembling smile, despite the fear clearly rising in her chest. "I got to see it," she whispered. "I got to see my final." "You are going to see many more," he said desperately, though even he no longer believed the words as he said them. Her hand tightened weakly around his, her breathing slowing further, despite the medical team now rushing toward them, and in the space of a few unbearable seconds, the woman who had taught a dangerous man how to feel joy again closed her eyes for the last time, her final vision one of green grass, bright lights, and the husband who had given her the impossible. The stadium fell into a silence deeper than any crowd noise could ever fill, the match still playing obliviously below, while Tae Jun knelt beside his wife's body, holding her against his chest, sobbing in a way none of his enemies, none of his allies, none of the world that feared him had ever witnessed. All the money he had spent, all the power he commanded, all the fear his name inspired across an entire city, none of it had been enough to keep her heart beating one moment longer. The medical team worked quickly around him, though their efforts changed nothing, and eventually one of them placed a gentle hand on his shoulder, offering the quiet confirmation he had already understood the moment her hand went still in his. He did not move for a long time, staring down at her face, memorizing the small details he suddenly feared he might forget, The shape of her closed eyes, the softness that remained even now, the faint impression of a smile that seemed to say she had gotten exactly what she asked for. On the field below, the match reached its final whistle, and somewhere far beyond the stadium walls, a nation erupted into celebration over a result that no longer meant anything to the only two people who had actually sat inside that arena that night. Fireworks lit the sky above the empty stands, bright and indifferent, while Tae Jun remained kneeling in the private box, holding his wife long after the noise outside had faded into silence. He carried her out himself when the time finally came, refusing every offer of help, walking slowly through the tunnel where players usually ran onto the pitch, past walls lined with photographs of legends who had once lifted trophies on that same grass. None of it mattered to him. The only trophy he had ever wanted to protect had already slipped through his hands, and no amount of history painted on those walls could soften that truth. The following days blurred into arrangements neither of them had ever discussed openly. Funeral preparations handled quietly through trusted contacts, every detail managed with the same secrecy that had protected their marriage since its beginning. Tae Jun moved through it all like a man functioning on instinct alone, grief pressed down beneath a composed exterior that fooled almost everyone who did not know him well enough to see the cracks. He chose her burial site himself, a quiet spot beneath a tree that offered shade in the afternoon, remembering how she once mentioned hating graves that sat exposed under harsh sunlight. He selected the flowers personally too, avoiding anything too formal, choosing instead the same simple blossoms she kept in a vase on their kitchen table every week, without fail. Small decisions, private and unnoticed by anyone else, became the only way he knew how to keep loving her once she was gone. Late one night, during that quiet week, unable to sleep, he sat alone in front of the television, turning it on out of habit more than desire, landing on a replay of an old match neither of them had ever discussed. He watched it in silence, waiting for her voice beside him to argue over a missed call or praise a clean tackle, and when the silence stretched on unbroken, he finally understood, in a way grief had not fully allowed until that moment, that 9 o'clock would never again mean what it once did. He kept her wig where she had left it on the bathroom counter, unable to move it, unable to throw it away, a small piece of her still sitting exactly where his hands had once set it down so gently. Some mornings he found himself standing in that doorway, simply staring at it, remembering the sound of her crying turned suddenly quiet the night he knelt in front of her, wishing he could return to that single moment and stretch it into forever. Because their marriage had never been public, he could not attend her funeral as her husband. He arrived instead disguised among mourners, a simple mask covering half his face, standing at the edge of the gathered crowd like a stranger, paying quiet respects to a woman whose advocacy work had touched more lives than most people ever realized. He watched from a distance as colleagues and friends spoke about her courage, her stubbornness, her refusal to stay silent when something was wrong, every word both a comfort and a fresh wound. One co-worker described the day Amara first brought the shipment records to their supervisor, refusing to back down even after being warned twice to drop the matter entirely. Another remembered her insisting on double-checking every figure herself, unwilling to accuse a company of wrongdoing without proof strong enough to survive scrutiny. Tae Jun listened to each story with his jaw tight, pride and grief tangled together so completely he could not separate one feeling from the other. Near the edge of the gathering, several men in expensive suits stood slightly apart from the mourners, their expressions carrying none of the grief surrounding them. Tae Jun noticed them immediately, recognizing the careless posture of men who attended such events only to protect appearances, not out of respect. He moved closer without drawing attention, positioning himself within earshot as their quiet conversation drifted toward him. "Convenient timing," one of them murmured, voice low but careless, in the way men speak when they believe nobody worth fearing is listening. "Saved us the trouble of dealing with her ourselves." Another chuckled softly, adjusting his tie. "Nature did what we did not have the stomach for. No mess, no investigation, just an unfortunate illness." Tae Jun's entire body went cold, every muscle locking into stillness as their words settled over him like ice. He recognized their faces now, understanding exactly which company they represented, exactly what history connected them to the woman he had just watched, lowered into the ground. "She spent years trying to shut us down," the third man said, shaking his head slightly. "All that money behind her, and she still could not stop chasing a cause that never needed her involvement in the first place. Some people simply cannot leave well enough alone." A fourth man, older than the rest, added quietly that stock prices had actually risen since the news of her death broke, since it removed the last serious internal threat to their disposal contracts before regulators had ever taken her complaint seriously. He said it the way a man might comment on the weather, indifferent, almost bored, as though the woman being buried a short distance away had simply been an inconvenient expense, finally cleared from the books. Tae Jun stood frozen among the mourners, mask hiding an expression that had shifted from grief into something far more dangerous, understanding now, with terrible clarity, that these men were not simply careless executives celebrating a convenient death. They were speaking as though her illness itself had been a mercy delivered to solve a problem she had created for them, a problem born entirely from her insistence on exposing what they buried. He remembered, suddenly and painfully, a promise she had extracted from him weeks earlier, delivered quietly during one of her clearer moments in the hospital. Her hand weak in his, but her voice steady, with the same conviction that had defined her entire life. "If anything happens to me," she had said, gripping his fingers with what strength remained, "promise me you will not become the man your enemies expect. Go after them the right way. Evidence, lawsuits. Let the truth do the damage, not you. I have spent my whole career believing the truth is stronger than fear. Do not prove me wrong the moment I am no longer here to argue with you." He had promised her then, meaning it fully, believing he could honor her memory through patience and legal precision rather than violence. Standing now among men laughing quietly over her grave, that promise strained against something older and more instinctive inside him, a fury that recognized no boundary these men had ever respected themselves. He left the funeral without confronting them, forcing himself to remember her words, and in the days that followed, he directed his lawyers to begin building a case using the very shipment records she had uncovered years earlier, evidence linking the company's disposal practices directly to the toxic exposure that ultimately caused her illness. He gathered documents quietly, methodically, exactly as she would have wanted, determined at first to keep his promise fully intact. The investigation moved forward for several weeks, evidence accumulating steadily, lawsuits prepared with careful precision designed to expose the company publicly and dismantle it through legitimate means. Tae Jun spent long nights reviewing files himself, driven by a discipline that surprised even his closest allies, refusing to let his grief collapse into the violence everyone around him expected. Then, during a routine review of internal company communications obtained through his legal team, he found something that shattered whatever restraint remained. Messages between executives revealed they had known for years about the health risks tied to their chemical processes, had specifically identified Amara as their most persistent and effective critic, and had discussed, in cold corporate language, how her advocacy threatened their profits far more than any regulatory body ever could. One message in particular, sent among the same 5 shareholders who controlled the company's board, dismissed her repeated warnings as an inconvenience they expected time and exposure to eventually resolve on its own. They had known. They had understood the danger she faced from prolonged exposure during her investigations, understood that her own health was deteriorating from the very substances she fought to expose, and had chosen silence over correction, because correction cost money they refused to spend. Something inside Tae Jun broke entirely upon reading those words, the careful restraint he had maintained since her funeral collapsing under the weight of confirmation that her death had not been an accident of nature, but the direct, foreseeable consequence of greed these men had chosen deliberately, repeatedly, over her life. He set aside the lawsuits that night, not entirely, but temporarily, driven now by something the legal system alone could never satisfy. He began locating each of the 5 shareholders individually, using resources and connections built over years of operating in the shadows of a city that feared his name, determined to ensure each man understood exactly what his choices had cost before facing whatever consequence awaited him. The first shareholder lived in a quiet, gated estate outside the city, a man who had built his fortune through decades of careful, ruthless business decisions. Tae Jun arrived alone one evening, moving through security with an ease that unsettled the man the moment he realized who stood uninvited in his study. "Choi Tae Jun," the man said, voice carefully controlled despite visible fear. "I assume this is a misunderstanding." "You knew about the chemical exposure," Tae Jun said quietly, closing the door behind him. "You knew what it was doing to the people living near your plants. You knew what it was doing to my wife." The man's composure faltered instantly at the mention of her, confusion flickering across his face before recognition dawned in his eyes, followed swiftly by dread. "Your wife," he repeated slowly. "Amara." "Say her name again," Tae Jun said, voice dangerously calm. "Tell me it was a misunderstanding." The man's protests dissolved into desperate explanations, admissions spilling out under pressure neither his money nor his connections could shield him from that night. By the time Tae Jun left the estate, a recorded confession existed, detailing years of deliberate negligence, evidence that would later prove devastating in the courtroom his lawyers had been preparing all along. The second shareholder proved harder to locate, hidden behind layers of assistants and private schedules. But Tae Jun found him eventually at a quiet countryside property he used to escape the pressures of the city. This man tried a different approach entirely, offering money the moment he realized why Tae Jun had come, sliding an offer across the table like it might undo years of silence. "Name a number," the man said, hands trembling despite his attempt at composure. "Whatever you want. This can disappear quietly." "You already tried that with my wife," Tae Jun said. "She refused your money too. She wanted you to stop poisoning people, not pay her to look away." The man laughed weakly, a sound with no humor in it at all, and shook his head as though trying to convince himself the situation was not as serious as it appeared. "She was one researcher," he said, "one voice among thousands who complain about companies like ours every year. We could not shut down operations every time someone raised a concern." "She was not one voice," Tae Jun said quietly. "She was the one voice who was right, and you knew it. And you let her keep breathing in the very chemicals she was warning you about, because correcting the problem would have cost you money you did not want to spend." The man's confession came slower than the first, but it came, delivered through tears and excuses that meant nothing against the weight of what he admitted, a clear acknowledgement that leadership within the company had discussed the health risks for years and chosen silence each time the subject arose. The third and fourth shareholders were located together, business partners who had built their careers attending the same meetings, signing the same documents, ignoring the same warnings, side by side, for over a decade. Confronted in the same evening, each attempted to blame the other, pointing fingers desperately in a room that offered neither of them an exit, until both confessions matched closely enough to confirm exactly how deliberate their collective negligence had been. The fifth and final shareholder was the oldest of the group, the one who had made the callous remark at the funeral about stock prices rising. Tae Jun found him in his office late one night, alone, reviewing quarterly reports with the same indifference he had shown standing over Amara's grave. "You said her death was convenient," Tae Jun said, stepping into the room. "You said it in front of her burial site." The man's face drained of color instantly, recognition arriving faster than for any of the others. "I did not know you were there," he stammered. "That is the problem with people like you," Tae Jun said. "You only regret your words when someone is listening who can make you pay for them." His confession, recorded like the rest, closed the final gap in the case Tae Jun's legal team needed. 5 separate admissions from 5 men who had each known, in their own way, exactly what their negligence had cost an entire community, including the one woman who had spent years trying to force them into accountability before her body gave out from the very substances they refused to stop producing. Driving away from that final estate in the early hours of the morning, Tae Jun did not feel the relief he had expected. The anger that had carried him from one confrontation to the next had finally emptied itself out, leaving behind something quieter and heavier, a grief that no confession, no matter how thorough, could ever repay. He pulled the car over near the river, where he had once told her to walk away from him while she still could, and sat there until sunrise, replaying every warning he had given her, every warning she had refused to take. He thought about the promise he had broken, turning her own words over in his mind until they blurred into something closer to forgiveness than guilt. She had wanted the truth to do the damage. In the end, the truth and his own hands had done it together, and he was no longer certain which part of that outcome she would have accepted and which part she would have grieved. News of the shareholders' sudden disappearances began circulating quietly within business circles, though authorities initially struggled to connect the pattern, distracted by the simultaneous release of damning internal documents now surfacing through anonymous legal channels. Reporters picked up the story slowly at first, then with mounting urgency as evidence of the company's negligence became impossible to ignore, forcing regulators to finally open the investigation Amara had spent years demanding. Within 2 months, the company collapsed entirely under the weight of public exposure, its licenses revoked, its remaining assets seized pending litigation from hundreds of families affected by decades of unchecked chemical dumping. The lawsuit Tae Jun's legal team pursued moved swiftly once the confessions and internal records became public record, finally delivering the accountability Amara had fought for her entire career, though she would never know the victory came at all. Television programs that had never once covered her advocacy work while she was alive suddenly ran lengthy segments about the young researcher who had spent years warning a company that eventually collapsed under the exact evidence she had gathered. Old footage of her speaking at a small community hearing years earlier resurfaced online, clips of her calm, determined voice explaining chemical readings to a room of officials who had barely listened at the time, now watched by millions who finally understood what she had been trying to prevent. Colleagues who once dismissed her warnings as excessive found themselves publicly recalling the meetings where she had first raised concerns, some expressing regret at not pushing harder alongside her when it might have mattered more, others simply grateful that her persistence had eventually forced the truth into daylight, regardless of the tragic cost required to get there. Families who had suffered quietly for years, dismissed repeatedly whenever they raised concerns about illnesses appearing near the company's disposal sites, finally received both acknowledgement and compensation through the settlement that followed, a small measure of justice that traced directly back to evidence Amara herself had gathered long before her diagnosis. Authorities eventually connected the disappearances to Tae Jun, evidence surfacing through channels even his careful planning could not fully suppress, and he was arrested weeks later without resistance, offering no denial, no defense, simply allowing himself to be taken into custody with the same quiet composure that had defined him since the night they first met in a parking garage stained with someone else's blood. The trial that followed drew significant public attention, both for the brutal nature of the charges and for the shocking revelations about the chemical company's decades of negligence that emerged during testimony. Tae Jun sat through each session largely silent, offering little beyond confirmation of facts already established, his expression unreadable to reporters who filled the courtroom daily, hungry for details about a man whose private life had remained hidden until his wife's death forced it into the light. Witnesses described the recorded confessions in detail, prosecutors arguing that no matter how deserving the victims, the manner of justice delivered could not be excused under any law. Tae Jun's lawyer countered carefully, painting a portrait of a grieving husband pushed beyond reason by men who had shown no remorse even beside a fresh grave, though everyone in the room understood the argument was unlikely to soften the outcome significantly. One afternoon, a family who had lost a child to illness linked to the same chemical exposure sat quietly in the gallery, watching the proceedings with an attention nobody else in the room carried. During a recess, the mother approached Tae Jun's lawyer and asked simply to pass along a message, That whatever the court decided, her family finally had answers because of the case built on Amara's original research and the evidence gathered afterward. Tae Jun said nothing when the message reached him, but for the first time since his arrest, something in his expression eased slightly, as though a small piece of the weight he carried had finally been set down. The prosecution called several former employees of the chemical company to testify about the culture of silence that had existed for years, describing warnings raised and dismissed, complaints filed and buried, a pattern that painted the shareholders less as isolated wrongdoers and more as the final layer of a system built entirely on ignoring people like Amara. Though none of it excused the killings in the eyes of the law, it shifted something in the courtroom's mood, a reluctant sympathy threading itself quietly beneath the formal proceedings. His lawyer, a longtime associate who understood exactly how much evidence stood against his client, urged him repeatedly to plead not guilty, arguing that circumstantial evidence alone could be challenged, that a skilled defense might reduce the severity of his sentence considerably. Tae Jun listened to each argument without interruption, expression calm, before shaking his head slowly during their final meeting before sentencing. "I am guilty," he said simply. "I will not stand in front of a court and pretend otherwise. This will cost you everything," his lawyer warned. "Do you understand what a guilty plea means here?" "I already lost everything," Tae Jun said quietly. "The day she died in that stadium, everything that mattered to me was already gone." On the day of his sentencing, the courtroom fell silent as Tae Jun stood before the judge, expression steady despite the weight of what awaited him. When asked if he wished to make a final statement, he spoke slowly, voice carrying none of the fear or defiance the room expected. "I do not ask for mercy," he said. "The men I found were responsible for my wife's death, and I made sure they understood that before facing what came next. I do not regret protecting her memory, though I understand the law cannot forgive how I chose to do it." He paused, gaze drifting briefly toward the window, where daylight filtered faintly into the room. "She asked me once to fight this the right way. I tried. Then I found proof they knew exactly what their negligence was doing to her, and something in me refused to let that go unanswered quietly. I accept whatever sentence this court decides. I only ask that whatever remains of what I own be given to the families who suffered the same exposure my wife spent her life trying to stop." Several reporters in the gallery lowered their notebooks briefly during his statement, something in his voice cutting through the usual detachment of a public trial, reminding the room that beneath every headline about violence and money sat a man who had simply loved someone completely and lost her anyway. The judge delivered a lengthy sentence, acknowledging both the severity of the crimes and the extraordinary circumstances surrounding them, though Tae Jun barely reacted to the number of years announced, his expression already distant, already somewhere beyond the walls of that courtroom. Outside the courthouse that day, a small crowd had gathered, some drawn by curiosity over the sensational headlines, others quietly holding photographs of family members affected by the chemical company's decades of negligence. One elderly woman stepped forward as guards led him toward the transport vehicle, holding up a faded picture of a granddaughter she had lost years earlier to an illness doctors could never fully explain until Amara's research finally connected the pattern. She said nothing, simply held the photograph high enough for him to see, and Tae Jun paused for one brief moment, meeting her eyes with something that looked almost like gratitude before the guards moved him forward again. He was transferred to a detention facility that evening, processed quietly among guards who recognized his name but said little, aware of the story that had dominated headlines for weeks. He spent his first night in a small cell, staring at a narrow window, offering only a sliver of sky, thinking of stadium lights and a woman whose laughter had once filled rooms far smaller than the empty world he now faced alone. He asked a guard that night, almost absently, whether the match from the final had ever aired again on any channel, whether anyone had kept a recording of it. The guard, confused by the question, simply said he did not know, and Tae Jun nodded once, returning his gaze to the narrow window, replaying instead the memory he still carried perfectly, her hand in his, her voice weak but happy, telling him she had finally seen her final. Early the following morning, a guard performing routine checks found him unresponsive. A letter left carefully on the small table beside his bed, addressed to his lawyer with instructions regarding his remaining estate. The letter confirmed what his final statement in court had already suggested, that his properties, accounts, and remaining assets should be transferred entirely to charitable organizations supporting families affected by industrial chemical exposure, continuing the very cause his wife had given her life defending. The letter closed with a single line that his lawyer chose never to share publicly, though its meaning eventually became known through those closest to the case. A simple statement explaining that he had served his sentence long enough to know he could not survive the remaining years without her, and that wherever she had gone after that stadium went silent, he intended to follow. His lawyer read that final line alone in his office late that night, setting the letter down slowly before allowing himself, for the first time since taking the case, a quiet moment of grief for a client the world would remember mostly for violence, but who he had come to understand, across long hours of preparation and testimony, as a man capable of a devotion most people never experienced, even once in an entire lifetime. News of his death spread quickly, reactions divided between those who saw a dangerous man finally facing consequence and those who understood, at least partially, the devastating love story hidden behind years of secrecy and violence. Reporters dug further into his past, uncovering fragments of a life kept deliberately hidden, interviews with hospital staff who remembered a husband who never left his wife's bedside, footage from stadium security confirming an empty arena rented for one impossible night, details that slowly transformed public perception from simple condemnation into something closer to tragic understanding. His estate, distributed exactly as instructed, funded medical research, environmental cleanup efforts, and support programs for families still suffering from exposure the chemical company had caused for decades before Amara's investigation finally forced accountability. Her name appeared on several of the funded initiatives, a quiet, permanent acknowledgement of the advocacy work that had defined her short life, work that ultimately outlived both her illness and the company that caused it. One of the programs funded in her name provided free health screenings for families living near former industrial sites, ensuring that no one else would have to discover too late, the way she had, that the ground beneath their homes carried a danger nobody had warned them about. Another funded scholarships for young researchers studying environmental health, a quiet continuation of the exact fight she had given her career and eventually her life to further. A third program, smaller than the others but perhaps closest to what Amara herself might have chosen, provided evening community screenings of major football matches in neighborhoods near the old industrial sites, free of charge, open to any family who wanted somewhere warm and bright to gather once a week. Nobody who attended those screenings ever fully understood the private meaning behind the initiative, though the organizers who managed the funding always made certain the biggest matches of the year, finals most of all, were shown on the largest screen available. The couple who had witnessed their small wedding years earlier were the ones who eventually arranged a private headstone beside Amara's grave, honoring Tae Jun's final wish to be buried near her rather than within his own family's grounds. The two graves sat together beneath the same tree he had chosen for her, shaded from harsh sunlight, exactly the way she once said she preferred. Side by side, in a quiet corner of the city, neither of them had ever visited together while she was alive. Visitors to that corner of the cemetery in later years, unaware of the full story behind the two names carved so closely together, sometimes noticed a small, worn football left resting at the base of the headstones, replaced quietly every so often by hands nobody ever saw. A private tribute from someone who understood exactly what those 9 o'clock evenings had once meant to the two people buried there. Groundskeepers who tended the cemetery grew used to the site over the years, never questioning it, simply mowing carefully around the small ball each time, as though some unspoken agreement had settled over that quiet corner of the grounds. Years later, the story of the mafia boss who bought an entire stadium for his dying wife would circulate quietly among people who valued privacy over sensationalism, told less as scandal and more as something closer to legend, a reminder that even in a world built on danger and secrecy, Love had briefly existed there too, stubborn and complete, refusing every border placed against it. Somewhere, in archives few people ever searched, old footage remained of that final match, broadcast to millions who never knew two people sat alone in an otherwise empty stadium that night. One of them watching her last match in peace, the other watching her with a devotion that outlasted even his own life, proving, in the quiet aftermath of everything that followed, that love, however dangerous, however doomed, could still triumph completely over every wall the world tried to build against it.